Rogue Tower is a game that takes classic tower defense gameplay elements and adds a roguelite twist to them. It can be incredibly fun, but there are some flaws that limit its replayability. So let's get into it. Like all tower defense games, your goal in Rogue Tower is to defend against waves of enemies, and you place different towers throughout the map in order to do so. A variety of enemy types will spawn each wave, and they'll progress down each lane until they reach your base and deal damage. Your towers attack enemies automatically on their own, but you can control which targets they prioritize, and of course, where you place those towers on the map. You can beat the game by clearing all 45 waves, but if your tower loses all of its health, your run is over. One of the main things that makes Rogue Tower a roguelike game, as opposed to a classic tower defense game, is the map itself is randomized. The map is split into chunks or tiles, and each wave, you choose to unlock a new tile, which will spawn more enemies and also allow you to place more towers in that new area. Additionally, you also don't have access to every tower at the start of each run. While you start with the ballista, in order to place other tower types, you must first unlock them between runs, which we'll talk about later on, then you must unlock them within each run. As you clear waves, you'll sometimes have the option to unlock a new card. You'll have a couple cards to choose from, and you'll pick one that best fits your build, best fits your run. So you might have a choice of unlocking between a new type of tower, unlocking a new damage increase for one of your towers, or other miscellaneous effects, such as cards that make condition damage more effective. This game also uses a fairly simple damage and armor system. There are 3 types of health that enemies can have. There is normal health, armor, and shield. And each tower that you unlock will deal more damage to one of these types and less damage to others. Additionally, you can also apply 3 different condition effects: bleeding, burning, and poison, which deal more damage to health, armor, and shield, respectively. There's nothing super complex about the system, but it does force you to have some tower variety and damage type variety, which as a whole, I enjoyed. There are a couple other systems in the game that created a nice balance between wanting to have a large number of one type of tower and having a variety of towers or a number of different types. For one, whenever you buy a tower, the next tower you buy of that type is more expensive. So every time you buy a ballista, the next ballista is 10 gold more. This encourages you to have a number of different types of towers because you can keep your costs down for each tower. Therefore, you get more bang for your buck when you buy that first tower of a new type as opposed to buying that 10th tower of the same type you already bought. But the card system also incentivizes you to have a lot of one type of tower, because a lot of card upgrades that you get within each run only apply to one tower type. So upgrade cards for the ballista only apply to the ballista. Also, the more you upgrade one tower with cards, the better upgrade cards you can find. So if you upgrade the ballista with 10 cards, that 11th upgrade might be even better. And as a whole, the ballista is just more powerful. So you want to build more ballistas as opposed to something else. I think as a whole, having a variety of towers is the winning strategy that's kind of forced onto you if you want to win. Mostly because of that cost mechanic and that need for damage type variety. But I did like that there are pros and cons of consolidation of towers, a lot of one type, versus having a large variety of towers or a number of different types. Some towers also required mana to function, so there's the secondary resource management quality as well. We have to balance mana consuming towers, mana producing towers, and non-mana using towers or to maximize your damage. I also quite liked how that tower upgrade system in the game worked. When towers are placed, you can upgrade their damage against one of the 3 health types. This means you have some flexibility with damage type for each tower. So even if a tower is naturally best against armor, you can make that individual tower better against shield by upgrading the shield damage for that individual tower. Additionally, you also find cards for certain towers that upgrade their damage against certain types. So again, you can take that same armor tower and make it better against shields by buying shield upgrades via cards for that tower. In addition to buying these upgrades for the tower, each tower will level up on its own as they deal more damage to each health type. So if a tower deals a lot of damage to shielded enemies, its shield damage will eventually upgrade on its own. Alternatively, if that tower is halfway to a new damage level, you can pay to finish the rest of that level at a reduced cost. So that ability to customize towers with their damage types, both for individual towers and for tower types via card upgrades, is nice and adds some nice flexibility to the game. I do think there was a missed opportunity to differentiate between health, armor, and shield though. They function exactly the same in game, so while they're named differently and require different towers to better deal damage to them, there's no meaningful mechanical or gameplay differences between those 3 types of health. Between the tower types, different cards, and different ways to level each tower, I found these tower defense elements to be enjoyable, and they were just fun to learn and master. And because of that, I really enjoyed the game as I played through it. At the same time though, once I had a few clears or a few successful runs, some of the flaws of the game limited how much I wanted to keep playing it. One notable flaw was the lack of game speed options. This actually only started to bother me after I cleared the game a couple of times, but once I could reliably get far into each run, that early game started to feel a little slow and less engaging, because I just knew I wasn't going to lose early on. This is a classic tower defense problem. I've had this problem with a number of tower defense games, and really game speeds are the only way to solve this. Because Rogue Tower doesn't have those game speeds, I had to address this problem by basically only playing the higher difficulty modes because they were just more engaging. And I'll talk about these difficulty levels a little later on. Outside of that, the game has flawed UI. It's very functional, and it has some nice customization options. So there's a sliding scale for the size of the UI, and it gives you data on each of your towers, letting you know which tower is dealing the most damage per gold spent. And I actually love that from a data standpoint. And there are also highly customizable targeting options for towers, ranging from highest health enemy first, fastest enemy first, near death, etc. And again, that customization was great. But the UI itself wasn't that user-friendly. For example, the UI scaling didn't apply to the towers themselves, which was weird. So I found myself having to zoom in sometimes, or to click on certain tower upgrades, or be able to read the text for the targeting options. The same problem could also apply to the cross-run upgrade menu. Additionally, I had to navigate the map in certain menus using only the arrow keys, or WASD, and just felt really awkward. You can also move the map around by right-clicking and dragging, but I didn't realize that until quite a lot of time playing this game, because I kept trying to drag the map with left-click only, which doesn't work. In terms of other small negatives, there's also no ability to click on enemies and check their health numerically or percentage-wise. You can only judge based on their tiny health bar above their head. And there's also no ability to save runs, which isn't that big of a deal here because runs aren't that long, but again, it's still a negative. So the game definitely has that indie game feel and that lack of polish to the menus and UI elements, but there isn't any missing functionality outside of that game speed option. Now let's talk about some of the randomness and variety in Rogue Tower. The two main sources of run-to-run randomness come in the form of the map layout and the cards you can find. The impact of the map randomness is kind of hard for me to evaluate because sometimes it felt really impactful, and other runs it felt very unimportant and forgettable. The map randomness mostly had a large impact on tower placement. In more standard tower defense games, you can look at the map and scope out all the best spots pretty quickly, but that slow revealing of the map in this game keeps that tower placement strategy fresh because more great spots open up as the map reveals itself. Most importantly, if a path turns around and loops back on itself, you can place towers in spots to cover more real estate and cover that path in more spots. However, one of my games actually had a path that was a pure straight line, which was, one, less interesting to play through, but two, there were also no cool or interesting tower placements. So really how dense that map is, or how much it loops back on itself, turns back on itself, can be really important for how you place your towers, and also how engaging the game is. There's also another RNG quality of the map, and I couldn't really tell if this was incredibly important or only mildly important. Sometimes, when you expand the map to start a new wave, the path can branch. So you can have one path or one spawning point, they will turn into multiple 2 or 3 different spawning points. I couldn't tell if the path's branching actually made more enemies spawn, or if it just made the same number of enemies spawn across more paths. I tried to count the number of enemies that spawned on certain waves, which was hard, and I couldn't really tell if I was noticing small differences or just not counting perfectly. Either way, the more branching paths you have, the harder it is because the more spread out your towers are, and the less you benefit from things like AoE effects, etc. As a result, getting a map with more branches, or more branches earlier on, is basically getting a harder game or harder run, as opposed to a map that doesn't branch at all, where you can streamline all of your towers. Because of that, the path branching could be incredibly important. In an ill-timed branching path, make your spire or home base take a lot more damage than you're prepared for. One important thing that is not random though are the waves themselves. Each wave is fixed, and the same enemy types will spawn on the same waves run to run. So while there is that map variety, which of course changes where the enemies spawn, you're never surprised by which enemies spawn in which wave. This is good in some ways in regards to being able to plan ahead and strategize for what towers you need when. You know which waves require increased armor damage, you know which waves require increased damage against shields. And again, this is generally good for planning. But I do think there's a missed opportunity here to add more replayability. And there are definitely ways to balance the need to plan ahead with adding different wave patterns or just more enemy variety or just something to keep the waves fresh, because the waves became a little too predictable the more that I played. The map also doesn't visually change very much run to run, and a lot of enemies look very similar. There are some small visual changes and different music plays when you reach certain thresholds, like wave 15, 25, 35, for example, but they weren't that big. I think some other themes or wave patterns or just something else would be nice. In addition to the map, the upgrade cards are also incredibly important. And these upgrade cards make up your build and how you'll tackle that run. These cards are incredibly impactful, and the fact that you need to draw certain cards to unlock each tower in the game makes each run feel different, because you almost never have the same set of towers run to run, and there are 12 offensive towers to unlock, as well as 5 or so defensive or utility towers. There are also so many different possible upgrade cards that it's pretty uncommon to get the exact same ones run to run. There was also a lot of room for fun combos, and as I mentioned earlier, there's that nice balance between a variety of towers and going deep into one certain tower type or damage type. For example, on one run I had this fun build where I had several towers stacking bleeding, I got cards that made my towers deal critical strike damage, and finally, I found a synergy card that made my critical strikes deal more damage if the enemy had more bleed. So it was a bleed build, a crit build, and some nice synergies. On some other runs, I just tried to get as many different tower types as possible to avoid the additive cost of building more and more of the same tower type, and that was also pretty successful. That said, I think there were two negatives with how the card RNG worked in this game. First, more than half the towers in this game consume mana in order to attack enemies. There's only 2 options for towers that create mana, and one of them is really cheap while the other is expensive. So if you want to use half the towers in the game, which consume mana, you kind of have to get that cheap mana producing tower, or you're screwed by RNG. Second, you really have to get at least 1 tower of each damage type in order to win a game and get pretty far. So if you don't get a shield tower, for example, a tower that deals damage to shield enemies, you're kind of screwed over, and it's really hard to win when those shield enemies start spawning. Both these problems are pretty fine when you start playing at first. Once your card pool gets really big, once you've unlocked a lot of card upgrades, it's possible to not get what you need because, again, that pool of options is just so diluted. As a whole, I think the game does a good job with randomness and variety in certain areas, namely that card system does a good job of making each run feel different, but I just wish there was some more enemy wave variety or different wave patterns or just something there to add some more replayability and variety on that side of the game as well. Because that randomized map was fine, but it just wasn't enough in my opinion. Rogue Tower is a very progression heavy game, and it's one of the most progression heavy roguelites that I've played, because you really need a couple important unlocks before it feels like you're really playing the full game. After each run, you get experience points based on how many waves you completed, whether it was new personal record for that game mode, and whether you won or not. You use this XP to unlock new cards, as well as permanent upgrades. These permanent upgrades are pure buffs to yourself in some form. They might make all towers deal more damage to a certain health type, or they might give your tower or base spire more health. Some of these upgrades are kind of essential though. For example, when you first start playing, you only get upgrade cards every 3 waves. With a couple of these cross-run upgrades, you can get these upgrade cards every single wave. And as you can imagine, that makes you way more powerful. It also just makes the game way more fun, because you can actually start build crafting and experimenting with different loadouts, different tower variety, etc. In a similar way, you can also use XP to unlock new cards. Every card you find within your run must first be unlocked with experience across runs. Some of these unlocks just add more build variety, but some of them, again, are basically essential at the start if you want to make any progress in your runs. Importantly, you need to unlock cards to give you access to different towers. You only start with the ballista unlocked, but if you want to actually win a run, you need at least 1 tower of each damage type, preferably even more. So between needing additional tower unlocks and unlocking certain important cross-run upgrades, it's practically impossible, if not literally impossible, to beat the game on your first run. But this also means the game gets a lot easier after you played a while because of those unlocks. To balance that out, this game offers a couple of different difficulty modes. There is the single lane mode, the double lane mode, and the triple lane mode. And these different difficulties affect how many lanes you start out with, and therefore how spread out your towers are, how much you benefit from AoE, things like that. Outside of that, I didn't find any other real gameplay differences, at least that I could tell. As I mentioned earlier, after I cleared that first single lane mode a couple times, it started to feel slow and pretty easy, so I moved on to the double and triple modes, and I played those almost exclusively. There's also a weird interaction between these difficulty modes in the XP system, because playing on higher difficulty levels gives you a lot faster XP relative to the single lane mode. I wouldn't say this game ever feels that grindy, but I did play the triple lane mode more frequently, when I realized that it gave a lot better experience, and I wanted to unlock some of those important unlocks to really get into the full game quicker. So if you're a fan of vertical progression and cross-run upgrades, this game has a lot of that to offer to you. But if you hate that feeling of needing to unlock a ton of things before you really get into the meat, really get into the full game, Rogue Tower is probably going to annoy you there. You do get the important unlocks relatively quickly. It never felt grindy to me, but this game is really balanced around you having a certain number of unlocks if you want to actually win a run. So what's my verdict on Rogue Tower? As a fan of both tower defense games and roguelites, this game offers a nice fusion and hybrid of those two genres. I had a lot of fun learning the mechanics and playing through it, and the card system made each run feel distinct with different optimizations and different strategies. However, I do think that long-term replayability of this game is somewhat lacking. My desire to play the game more kind of fell off once I could reliably clear runs, get wins. And that's partly because I wish there was more variety in terms of which enemies spawn in which waves, or just something there to spruce up the enemy variety, make it feel less samey run to run. And as I mentioned before, that lack of game speed options really holds this game back in terms of replayability. As a whole, I would recommend this game to people who like tower defense games, or are just looking for a different type, different style of roguelite. But this is definitely not going to top my list of most played roguelites because of those limitations that just, again, limit that replayability for me. Huge shout out and thank you to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.